Hi, I'm Charles Alexander. I want to welcome you to the community of writers. I'm a member of the poetry community, a publisher of poetry and a teacher of poetry at Community College. One of the activities I'm most involved with here is an organization called POG, Poetry in Action, where my guest, Stephen Salmoni, is also one of the directors of that organization. Stephen is director of the writing programs at Pima Northwest Campus, and he's also, to be frank and open, one of my best friends in the poetry community, not only locally, but anywhere. One of the people I send my own poems to as an early reader, and someone I admire greatly. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you for having me.
Okay.
I always call Charles my big brother in poetry, the brother I never had, but certainly as a mentor and a friend and a colleague. I mean, I couldn't hope for anything better.
Well, we share some of the same struggles
Yeah.
in this art in terms of making and teaching.
Yeah.
And I want to first engage you as a teacher of poetry.
Sure.
And what you mostly teach people in their first couple of years of
Right.
college. What do you try to convey to them about poetry and about the possibilities of poetry?
That's a great question. And I know you mentioned that a couple of days ago in my office, and I confess I was thinking about it all the way home, and I almost drove right past my house because it's a compelling question. And I've taught writing in some form, mostly composition, since 1992, I think. So at the very least, bringing a sensibility of how to run a writing classroom. And I don't know if there's that much difference between a comp classroom and a poetry classroom, but the creative writing classrooms, especially here, which I've been so privileged to be able to do so, teach here for so many years, is challenging in that there's not a single kind of reason for being there, or a single set of values or attributes. There are people who take it for no other reason that it fills the art credit.
Right.
And the people who've been writing for years who've come back to school and want to just, have somebody to talk to and share their, they have reams and reams of work, and it's incredible.
But for some, it's the only class they take. They just sign up for that class, and they may be 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, and they are writers.
Yeah.
But they want to be among writers as well.
And I think that's probably the first thing that I try to convey, is that there's the myth of writing as the solitary activity, and you're in the ivory tower, and it's a struggle, and it's romantic. And to be true, or at least the way I understand it, and knowing you is a big part of that, writing is a community, and it's a shared experience, and it's not something that grows or goes any place done in complete solitude. And so we try to move the sense of poetry from something singular to something plural. Poetries, as Charles Bernstein, I think, said. Right?
I think of moving it sometimes from something metaphorical to something metonymical. Yeah. And that may take some explaining, to have a metaphor is to see one thing in terms of another thing. To have a metonymical possibility is to see one thing beside another, beside another, beside another, and to not necessarily force commonalities, but to see that that is the landscape we're working in.
Absolutely.
And I find when I teach poetry with that sense, one of the things I'm teaching is that poems don't have to cohere in the way many people think they should, i.e., when you're finished reading, you understand it, it makes a nice unit, it concludes, it's done. Rather, that it proposes questions, possibilities, and keeps them open, and one has to sort of live in some uncertainty. And
oh, absolutely.
What challenge do you find that poses to particularly new students to poetry?
Well, I teach the essay the same way, actually, which may or may not be appropriate. But one of the wonderful questions or situations that comes up in any workshop is a student will say, well, I don't know if this makes sense or not. And I love that phrase, because making sense, considered literally, is something that we should explore and think about the way the poem makes its own way through a kind of sensibility, uses the senses to make something, poiesis, and the idea of making or creating something. And so I try to shift the argument or shift the discussion from, I don't know if this is a unity or if this has meaning or if this communicates, but something which is an open-ended, ongoing process of making, of exploring senses that we don't know that we have. And poems actually, one of their jobs is to make sense happen.
On the other hand,
you know,
as the Talking Heads said, stop making sense.
Exactly,
And,
yeah.
and I've been rereading the poet Leslie Scalapino, and who was very much afraid of, not afraid of, but wanted to oppose hierarchical values
Yeah.
in the poem and
Yeah.
hierarchical values of poet versus reader.
Right.
And certainly felt at some point, and this was like late 1970s for a long time, that meant making work that in which even finding the content was rather
Yeah.
difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah.
So you're almost proposing a free play of the mind
Right.
space to the reader.
Right. Language, as it unfolds, is the content. I think that goes very nicely with the metaphor metonym idea. Metaphor can be understood as this vertical axis. Here's the meaning. It's this sort of transcendental thing. Metonym is this horizontal extension, and it's often thought of in terms of prose, but poetry or
Yes.
a multiplicity of writers together, of voices, can be
Although
thought of as that.
I have found in the carrying out of a longer poem I've been working on for seems like ever, that you can have metaphors and a metonymic landscape at the same time.
Charles is talking about pushing water, which everybody has to run and get. It's a beautiful book, yeah.
Could you just mention maybe 2 or 3 poets who are formative for you?
Sure.
Even if they're not necessarily the same ones you read now.
Of course, and there is probably a real difference. I went to college in Amherst College in Massachusetts, where Robert Frost was the prevailing deity. There was a big statue of him outside, and I don't know if Frost necessarily was the one that I adhered to, but that whole New England transcendentalist idea, and I would cut class and walk through the woods with my copy of Whitman and my copy of Dickinson in my pockets, and that was my education in some sense. So
you were a modern transcendentalist.
I wanted to do a thesis where I just build a cabin in the woods and just live there like Thoreau. That was my idea. Not thinking about the winter necessarily, but so certainly that, and Wallace Stevens, probably out of all those, was for me the genesis of thinking about poetry. I took a wonderful course with a man named Francis Murphy, a fantastic old-time scholar. He wrote the introduction to Leaves of Grass, I think, for one of the big Penguin editions. I mean, he was that kind of guy. And we read Stevens. I never really read Stevens before, but just the way in which poetry as thought on the page, and just the exoticism of his language and the feeling of living, because he's from Hartford, Connecticut, so it's right nearby. And those colors, those sensibilities, and the relationship of poetry to thinking or poetry to philosophy, which I always felt was a productive and relevant one, rather than an opposition.
Yeah, it seems sometimes like an expectation students seem to have is that poetry will be about someone's experience, someone's emotions, and sometimes they're a little caught up when they find a Wallace Stevens whose work may be considered a philosophy, may propose a philosophy. That same thing would be true of Scalapino that I mentioned, of Paul Celan or Edmond Jabez, international poets of great stature. And so do you think there is a responsibility of the poet to connect to the audience, or is it more like a responsibility of the audience to find whatever that connecting point might be? And is that even a distinction that makes sense?
No, that's a really good question, and I would confess, and this might make me something of a monster, that I don't necessarily have that as a concern. I mean, my concern really is with the truth, or maybe small t truth and a capital T truth, but the aesthetic and the musical and the lyrical and the conceptual process of making something I'm making a structure. It's a machine made of words, right, like William says. And whether or not it gets read or understood. I mean, I've done readings and people look at me like I'm, reading in a foreign language. And I mean, that's okay, but it's supposed to go back to that sense of making sense. It's pushing the horizon forward of what poetry can do. And I'd like to be understood.
Yep.
I
was reading something to students a few days ago about how poets generally want to be understood, but they also have a need to use their complete intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you do that, it drives you to places that are not easy. They're not easy at all. Yeah. And, okay.
Salman Rushdie had an idea that you can only be the kind of writer that you are.
Oh, I love
not
that.
I mean, so and these days too, it is necessary, I think, to be more active and more political and more community building and more expressive, and because it's maybe hard to justify writing a poem with some of the things that are happening, but if I could do that, I would do that. I could only do what I can do, and hopefully that the opening of perception, the opening of experience, the sensitivity to very, very obscure and finely rendered things might itself be a kind of ethic or a kind of value.
I know you bring all of your sense of poetry and intelligence and desire for it to be a community activity to your work in the group we're both part of, POG, Poetry in Action. Could you talk about your involvement a little bit with that?
Yeah, well, it really comes out of meeting you, and when I first got hired at Pima in 2005, I was curious about what Tucson was about. I didn't know much about Tucson, and I did a Google search of experimental poetry Tucson, something like that, and I came upon POG in a very early incarnation, maybe the old website. I thought, wow, okay, this seemed the people who they're bringing, Leslie Scalapino, Ron Silliman, et cetera, et cetera. There was a beautiful thing that you had written before I even knew you about Tucson being a very beautiful area and then a kind of crappy city, No, I mean, not like that, but a city whose infrastructure did not necessarily conform to the beautiful landscape, but what a wonderful place it was to be, and what a nice. So I thought, okay, I could actually move to Tucson.
I understand there's even a movement right now among younger people. It's like, I don't know if I can say this on the community of writers, but keep Tucson shitty. Yeah. And in part to avoid the kind of gentrification that doesn't always allow the community possibilities that are there.
Sure. My best years were probably in San Francisco as a young man, and it's become unlivable. You can't be anything but a tech person there anymore.
One of the poets we're bringing, that POG, that you and I and others are bringing, is Joseph Lease. And I have a book, and I thought I would just read one very short thing and get your take on it, because we just have a minute or here. And it's called Rent is Theft. It says, hide me among the graves, the city, the wind, the banks. You just want to die. I mean, capitalism just wants to kill you. I mean, you just want, and you just want. Rent is theft. We made this sky of drones to eat your voice. The sky is money. Privatize the sky. Your ocean dies, and Google buys the sun inside your name.
Wow. How much time do we have?
You may not have heard that before.
No, I'm familiar a little bit with his work, and I know it does have those kinds of overtones. I mean, he's right.
Okay.
I can't argue with that.
I understand we're about out of time, so I'm going to have to conclude this by thanking you for being here.
Thank you,
if people
Charles.
want to hear more from Joseph Lease, come to a reading this spring.
Please do.
And thank you for being here with the Community of Writers.
Thank you, Charles. It's a gift.